The blood on her dress had barely dried when Beatrice Walsh stumbled through the back door of her uncle's ranch house, her fingers trembling as she clutched the leather journal that would destroy him. The December wind of 1884 howled across the Wyoming plains, carrying with it the promise of snow and the end of everything she had ever known. She had found the ledger hidden beneath the floorboards while searching for her mother's wedding ring, and the numbers written in her Uncle Howard's careful hand told a story of theft, murder, and a fortune built on the graves of innocent ranchers who had trusted him. Now she ran, her boots crunching against the frozen ground, knowing that the man who had raised her after her parents died would kill her without hesitation to protect his secrets. The first snowflakes began to fall as she reached the edge of the property, and she heard his voice behind her, rough with fury and something darker. Howard Walsh had always been a hard man, his face weathered by sun and cruelty in equal measure, but she had never seen the monster beneath until tonight. He shouted her name, and the sound carried across the empty fields like a death sentence. Beatrice ran toward the dark line of trees that marked the boundary between her uncle's land and the open range, her lungs burning in the frigid air. The journal pressed against her ribs beneath her coat, its pages containing evidence of 17 murders spanning 5 years. 17 families who had refused to sell their land to Howard Walsh. 17 mysterious accidents and disappearances that no one had questioned, because Howard owned half of Carbon County and had the sheriff in his pocket. Her mother's sister had married Howard when Beatrice was just 6 years old, and when fever took both her parents 3 years later, he had taken her in without complaint. She had thought it kindness. She had thought he loved her. But tonight, she had seen him strike his wife, her Aunt Margaret, hard enough to draw blood, and when Margaret had collapsed sobbing, Howard had stood over her and said he would do far worse if she ever questioned him about the Henderson property again. The Hendersons had vanished last spring, and their land had been absorbed into Howard's holdings by summer. The snow fell faster now, thick flakes that obscured the landscape and turned the world into a shifting curtain of white. Beatrice's dark hair came loose from its pins, whipping across her face as she fought her way through the storm. She could hear Howard behind her, his footsteps heavy and determined. He was not a young man at 45, but he was strong and he knew this land better than anyone. She had no plan beyond reaching Rawlins, 8 miles south, and finding someone who would listen, someone Howard did not control. But the storm was worsening by the minute, and she knew with sick certainty that she would not survive the night in the open. Her dress and coat were meant for indoor life, not for running through a Wyoming blizzard, and already she could not feel her fingers or toes. The trees loomed ahead, dark shapes in the swirling snow, and she crashed into them gratefully, hoping the forest would slow Howard down. Branches caught at her clothes and scratched her face, but she pushed forward, her breath coming in ragged gasps that turned to ice crystals in the air before her. Behind her, Howard was shouting again, his words lost in the wind but his rage unmistakable. Beatrice's foot caught on a root and she went down hard, landing in a drift of snow that had gathered between the trees. For a moment she lay there, stunned and breathless, staring up at the black sky and the endless snow falling from it. She thought of her mother, who had sung to her in the evenings before the fever took her voice and then her life. She thought of her father, who had taught her to read and to question everything, who had believed that women were just as capable as men of understanding the world and shaping it. They would have wanted her to fight. They would have wanted her to survive. She struggled to her feet, her dress heavy with snow and ice, and kept moving. The forest was denser here, the trees providing some shelter from the storm, but the darkness was almost complete. She could barely see 3 feet ahead, and every shadow seemed to hold danger. Her uncle's footsteps were closer now, crunching through the snow with methodical patience. He knew she could not escape. He was simply running her down like a wounded deer. Then the trees broke open into a small clearing, and Beatrice saw a figure standing in the center of it, illuminated by the strange pale light that snow brings to the darkest nights. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy sheepskin coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the storm. A cowboy by the look of him, with weathered chaps and a bandana tied around his neck. He stood perfectly still, watching her approach, and something about his stillness made her stumble to a halt. Howard burst from the trees behind her, and she spun around, backing toward the stranger without thinking. Her uncle's face was twisted with cold and anger, his eyes wild beneath the brim of his hat. He had a rifle in his hands, and he raised it without hesitation, pointing it directly at her chest. The cowboy moved then, stepping between them with a fluid grace that belied his size. He was younger than Howard by 20 years, perhaps 26 or 27, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days of stubble and eyes that caught the light like polished steel. He said nothing at first, simply stood there with his arms loose at his sides, blocking Howard's line of fire. "Move aside," Howard snarled, his breath steaming in the frozen air. "This is family business and none of your concern." The cowboy studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady, carrying clearly despite the wind. "Turn around now." 3 words delivered without heat or threat, but something in them made Howard hesitate. Beatrice could see the calculation in her uncle's eyes, weighing whether this stranger was worth the trouble. The rifle remained pointed at the cowboy's chest, but Howard's finger had moved away from the trigger. "I will not repeat myself," the cowboy continued, his tone unchanged. "The lady stays with me. You turn around and go home." Beatrice found her voice, though it came out hoarse and shaking. "He killed 17 people, I have proof. He will kill me too if I go back." Howard's face darkened further and he swung the rifle toward her again. "You stupid girl. You know nothing about what it takes to build something in this territory. Those people were in my way, and I removed them. Just like I will remove you if you do not give me that journal right now." The cowboy moved faster than Beatrice would have thought possible for a man his size. His hand shot out and grabbed the barrel of the rifle, twisting it upward just as Howard pulled the trigger. The shot exploded into the night sky, the sound deafening in the small clearing, and then the cowboy had the rifle in his own hands and was leveling it at Howard with calm precision. "I said turn around," he repeated, and this time there was steel beneath the quiet words. "If I see you again tonight, I will assume you mean the lady harm and I will respond accordingly. Do you understand me?" Howard's face went through several rapid changes, from rage to calculation to something almost like fear. He was a man accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any situation, and finding himself disarmed and outmatched had shaken him badly. For a moment Beatrice thought he might try to rush the cowboy anyway, might let his pride overcome his sense of self-preservation, but then he took a step backward, then another. "This is not over," he said, his voice thick with venom. "She is my ward and I have every legal right to retrieve her. The law is on my side." "The law can wait until morning," the cowboy replied. "By then, maybe the sheriff will want to hear what the lady has to say about those 17 murders you just confessed to." He paused, letting that sink in. "I heard every word, Mr. Walsh, and I have a good memory." Howard's face went pale beneath its weathered tan, and Beatrice realized he had just made a fatal mistake in his anger. He had admitted everything in front of a witness, someone he did not control and could not easily dispose of. The balance of power had shifted in those few moments, and they all knew it. Her uncle stared at the cowboy for a long moment, then at Beatrice, and she saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. Not defeat, but calculation. He was already planning his next move, already figuring out how to spin this situation to his advantage. But for now, he turned and walked back into the trees, his shoulders hunched against the storm, and then he was gone. Beatrice's legs gave out, and she sank to her knees in the snow, shaking violently. The adrenaline that had kept her moving drained away all at once, leaving her hollow and terrified. She had escaped, but she knew Howard would not give up. He had too much to lose, and he had never been a man to accept defeat. The cowboy ejected the remaining shells from the rifle and tossed them into the snow, then knelt beside her. Up close, she could see his face more clearly, the strong features and the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow. His eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds, and they studied her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow was not. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice gentler now. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and he helped her to her feet with a hand under her elbow. His grip was strong but careful, and even through her coat she could feel the warmth of his touch. She realized she was freezing, that her entire body was numb except for the places where he held her. "My camp is just through those trees," he said, gesturing to the far side of the clearing. "It is not much, but it is out of the wind and I have a fire. You need to get warm before you lose any fingers or toes." "I need to get to Rawlins," Beatrice managed through chattering teeth. "I need to find someone who can help, someone Howard does not own." "You will not make it to Rawlins tonight in this storm," the cowboy said flatly. "Look at you. You are already half frozen. Another hour out here and you would be dead." He paused, then added more quietly, "Your uncle knows that. He was counting on it. Let the storm do his work for him, and no one could blame him for your death." The truth of his words hit her hard, and she swayed on her feet. Howard had not needed to shoot her. He had only needed to chase her into the wilderness in a blizzard and wait for nature to take its course. By morning, she would have been just another tragic accident, a foolish girl who ran off in a storm and froze to death. No one would have questioned it. "Come on," the cowboy said, and this time it was not a request. He kept his hand on her arm and guided her across the clearing and into the trees on the far side. After a minute of careful walking, she saw the orange glow of a fire through the branches, and then they were stepping into a small sheltered area where he had made camp, beneath an overhang of rock. It was surprisingly warm, the overhang reflecting the heat of the fire back into the small space, and Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes at the relief of it. The cowboy settled her near the fire and draped a thick blanket around her shoulders, then set about making coffee in a battered tin pot. He moved with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and sure, and she found herself watching him despite her exhaustion. "What is your name?" she asked finally, her voice still shaky. He glanced at her, something that might have been amusement flickering in his gray eyes. "Caleb Osborne. I have been working the trail between here and Montana, bringing cattle down for winter market. Got caught by the storm and decided to wait it out rather than push through." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed her one. "And you are Beatrice Walsh, unless I miss my guess. Howard's niece." She wrapped her frozen fingers around the cup, absorbing its warmth. "How did you know?" "I have been in Rawlins for a few days, selling off stock and resupplying. Howard Walsh is not a popular man, but he is a powerful one and people talk about him. They mention his niece sometimes, the educated girl from back east who came to live with him after her parents died." Caleb settled back against the rock wall, his own cup cradled in his hands. "What they do not mention is that he is a murderer." Beatrice pulled the journal from inside her coat with numb fingers and held it out to him. It is all in here. Names, dates, methods. He kept records of everything like he was proud of it, like it was just another business transaction. Caleb took the journal carefully and opened it, tilting it toward the firelight to read. His expression grew darker with each page he turned, his jaw tightening. When he finally closed it and handed it back to her, his eyes were cold. This is enough to hang him 10 times over if you can get it to someone honest. The question is whether such a person exists in Carbon County. The territorial marshal, Beatrice said. He does not answer to local officials. If I can get this to him, Howard cannot bury it. The marshal is in Cheyenne right now, according to the talk in town. He will not be back through Rawlins until spring. Caleb frowned, thinking. But there is a federal judge who rides the circuit through these parts. Judge Theodore Mitchell. He is supposed to be honest, and he is not someone Howard Walsh can threaten or buy off easily. He should be in Laramie next week. Laramie, Beatrice repeated. It was more than 100 miles away, across some of the roughest country in Wyoming territory. In December. In a blizzard. How would I even get there? We would ride, Caleb said simply. I have 2 horses and enough supplies to get us there if we are careful. Once this storm clears, we can head out. Beatrice stared at him, unable to quite believe what she was hearing. You do not even know me. Why would you help me? Why would you risk Howard's anger? Caleb was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was soft but firm. Because 17 people are dead and someone should answer for that. And because I do not like seeing men use their strength to hurt women. He looked at her then, and there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. My mother was killed by a man like your uncle, someone who thought his money and his position put him above the law. No one helped her, and no one held him accountable. Maybe I cannot change that, but I can help you. Something shifted in Beatrice's chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the coffee. This stranger, this cowboy who owed her nothing, was offering to risk his life for her, for justice, for the memory of 17 dead ranchers he had never met. It was more than anyone else had ever done for her, including the family who should have protected her. Thank you, she whispered, and the words seemed completely inadequate. Caleb nodded once, then stood and moved to the edge of the sheltered area, peering out into the storm. It is getting worse. We will be stuck here until morning at least, maybe longer. You should try to sleep. I will keep watch in case your uncle decides to come back. Beatrice wanted to protest that she could not possibly sleep, that she was too frightened and too cold and too aware of everything that had happened, but exhaustion was pulling at her like a physical weight. The warmth of the fire and the blanket around her shoulders, the knowledge that someone was watching over her, all of it combined to make her eyelids heavy. She lay down near the fire, curling into the blanket, and within minutes she was asleep. She woke several times during the night, startled by the howling wind or by dreams of Howard's rifle pointed at her chest. And each time she saw Caleb sitting near the entrance to their shelter, alert and watchful. Once, when she woke shivering despite the fire, he added another blanket on top of her and built up the flames. He said nothing, but his presence was steady and reassuring, an anchor in the chaos that her life had become. Morning came gray and cold, the storm still raging beyond their shelter. Caleb made breakfast from supplies in his pack, simple fare of coffee and hardtack and dried beef, but Beatrice ate it gratefully. She felt stronger after sleeping, more able to think clearly about what came next. Tell me about yourself, Caleb said as they ate, his tone casual but his eyes curious. Howard said you came from back east. Where exactly? Boston, Beatrice replied. My father was a lawyer there and my mother came from old money. They moved out here when I was 5 because my father wanted to make his own way without my mother's family's influence. He started a practice in Cheyenne, and we were happy." She stared into her coffee, remembering. Then the fever came, and within a week they were both gone. I was 9 years old, and Howard was the only family I had left. He raised you, after a fashion. He sent me to boarding school in Denver mostly, and I only came back to the ranch for summers and holidays. I think he did not really know what to do with a child, especially a girl." She smiled without humor. "I always thought he was just uncomfortable with children. Now I wonder if he was afraid I would see too much, figure out too much. He kept me away until I was old enough to be controlled, to be convinced that he was respectable and upright." "What made you start looking for evidence?" Caleb asked quietly. Beatrice closed her eyes, remembering the scene that had shattered her willful blindness. "3 days ago, a woman came to the ranch, Sarah Henderson. She was the daughter of the family that disappeared last spring. She had been away visiting relatives in Nebraska, and when she came home, her entire family was gone and Howard owned their land. She was crying, begging him to tell her what happened to her parents and her brothers. She opened her eyes and met Caleb's gaze. He had her thrown off the property. Told his men she was crazy with grief and imagining things, but I saw his face when she left. He was satisfied, almost smug, and I started to wonder. So you searched his things, and found the journal and found out that the man who raised me is a monster." Her voice broke on the last word, and she fought to steady it. "I keep thinking about all those years, all the times he acted like a concerned guardian, and knowing it was all a lie, knowing that he only kept me around because getting rid of me would have raised questions he did not want to answer." Caleb reached over and covered her hand with his, the gesture brief but warm. "You are not responsible for what he did. You were a child and then you were deliberately kept in the dark. What matters is that you are trying to make it right now." His words, simple and matter-of-fact, helped more than elaborate reassurances would have. Beatrice nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence. "What about you? You said your mother was killed. What happened?" Pain flickered across Caleb's face, old and deep. "I was 14. We lived in Texas, on a small ranch my father had built with his own hands. There was a rich rancher nearby who wanted our land because it had water rights he needed. He made my father an offer, and when my father refused, he started causing trouble. Cattle disappeared. Our barn burned down. Finally, one night, men came to the house. He stopped, his jaw tight, and Beatrice could see him fighting for control. They killed my father right away, shot him when he tried to defend us. My mother they hurt first to make a point, then they killed her too." "Oh God," Beatrice breathed. "Caleb, I am so sorry. I was hiding where my father had told me to, watching through the floorboards. After they left, I came out and found them both dead. The sheriff ruled it an accident, said drifters must have done it, but everyone knew the truth. No one would speak against the rich rancher, though. He had too much power." Caleb's voice was flat now, empty of emotion, as if he had told this story too many times for it to hurt him the way it once had. "I buried my parents and left Texas, never went back. How did you survive?" "Worked ranches, learned to handle cattle and horses. I was good at it and I grew fast. By 16 I could pass for 20, and by 20 I was foreman on a big spread in Colorado. I saved my money, learned to read and write better at night by firelight, made something of myself." He looked at her, and his eyes were fierce. "My parents died for nothing, and their killer lived free and rich until he died of old age 5 years ago. I swore I would never let that happen to someone else if I could prevent it. So when I saw you running from your uncle when I heard him admit to murder, I knew I had to help." Beatrice felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but she did not wipe them away. This man, This stranger had turned his tragedy into purpose, his pain into protection for others. He had every reason to be bitter and angry and closed off, but instead he was here, risking his life for her. "You are a good man, Caleb Osborne." He looked uncomfortable with the praise, ducking his head slightly. "I am just a cowboy doing what is right. Anyone decent would have done the same." "No," Beatrice said firmly. "They would not have. Most people would have turned away, would have decided it was not their problem. But you stood between me and a loaded rifle without even knowing me. That takes a special kind of courage." Caleb did not respond, but color rose in his cheeks, and Beatrice realized she had embarrassed him. She changed the subject, asking him about his work and his travels, and he relaxed as he talked about the ranches he had worked and the country he had seen. He had a way of describing things that made them come alive, and she found herself fascinated by his stories of cattle drives and wild horses, and the vast, empty spaces of the Western Territories. The storm continued all that day and into the next night, keeping them trapped in their small shelter. Caleb proved to be good company, intelligent and thoughtful despite his limited formal education. He asked her about Boston and her schooling, and listened with genuine interest as she talked about the books she had read and the ideas she had encountered. They discovered a shared love of poetry, though his taste ran to the romantic verses of Lord Byron, while she preferred the nature writings of William Wordsworth. As the hours passed, Beatrice became increasingly aware of Caleb in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude or shared circumstance. She noticed the way the firelight caught in his dark hair, the strength in his hands as he tended the fire or checked on the horses he had brought into a sheltered area nearby. She noticed the scar through his eyebrow and wondered how he got it, noticed the way his rare smiles transformed his serious face into something approaching beautiful. She caught him watching her too, his gray eyes lingering on her face before quickly looking away, and she felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It was foolish, she told herself. They had known each other for barely 2 days, and they were only together because of terrible circumstances. And yet she could not deny the connection she felt, the sense that she understood him, and he understood her in ways that went beyond words. On the second morning, the storm finally broke. The wind died down and the snow stopped falling, leaving the world buried under 3 feet of white powder that sparkled in the weak winter sunlight. Caleb surveyed the landscape and announced that they could travel, though it would be slow going. They packed up the camp, Caleb moving with practiced efficiency while Beatrice helped as best she could. He had 2 horses, sturdy animals built for endurance rather than speed, and he helped her onto the smaller of the 2 before mounting his own. The journal was safely tucked inside her coat, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. "We will take it slow," Caleb said. "The horses need to pick their way through the drifts, and we need to watch for weak ice on any streams we cross. With luck, we can make 15 miles today and find shelter before dark." They set out across the snow-covered landscape, leaving the sheltered camp behind. Beatrice kept looking back over her shoulder, half expecting to see Howard pursuing them, but the emptiness stretched out unmarked in all directions. Still, she could not shake the feeling that they were being watched, that danger was following them. The travel was as slow as Caleb had predicted, the horses laboring through the deep snow while their riders scanned the horizon for landmarks and shelter. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch of jerky and hardtack. Caleb climbed a small rise to look around, and when he came back down his face was grim. "There are riders behind us," he said quietly. 4 or 5, maybe 2 miles back. Could be innocent travelers, but I doubt it." Beatrice's stomach dropped. "Howard, most likely." He either came after us himself or sent his men. Caleb helped her back onto her horse, his movements quick but controlled. We need to pick up the pace, push the horses harder. There is a lined shack I know about, maybe 10 miles from here. If we can reach it before they catch up to us, we can ford up there and make them think twice about attacking. They rode faster now, the horses plunging through the snow with visible effort. Beatrice could feel her mount tiring beneath her, could see the steam rising from its neck, but Caleb kept them moving. Several times she glanced back and saw the distant shapes of riders behind them, dark figures against the white landscape, steadily closing the distance. The sun was sinking toward the horizon when Caleb pointed ahead to a small structure, barely visible against a hillside. The lined shack was tiny, just one room with a stove and a few bunks, but it was built solidly with walls thick enough to stop bullets. They rode the horses right up to the door and dismounted quickly, and Caleb hauled their supplies inside while Beatrice led the exhausted animals around to the back of the shack, where a lean-to offered some shelter. "Get inside," Caleb ordered, his voice sharp with urgency. They are less than a mile away now. Beatrice ran for the door, and Caleb slammed it behind her, dropping a heavy bar into place to secure it. There were 2 small windows, one facing front and one facing back, and he positioned himself at the front one with his rifle ready. Beatrice moved to the back window and peered out, her heart hammering against her ribs. The riders came into view minutes later, 5 men on horseback moving at a steady trot. Even from a distance, Beatrice recognized her uncle at the front of the group, his heavy coat unmistakable. The other 4 were ranch hands who worked for him, hard men who followed orders without question. They stopped about 100 yards from the shack, just out of easy rifle range, and sat their horses in a loose semicircle. Howard urged his mount forward a few steps and called out, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Beatrice, you have made your point, girl. Now stop this foolishness and come home. We can work this out like family." Caleb glanced at her, his expression questioning. She shook her head firmly. "He will kill me the moment I step outside." "That is what I figured," Caleb said. He moved to the door and shouted through it without opening it, "The lady does not want to go with you, Walsh. You and your men turn around and leave, or this is going to get ugly." Howard's laugh was harsh and humorless. "You have no idea who you are dealing with, Cowboy. I own this county and everyone in it. You cannot win here." "Maybe not," Caleb called back, "but I can make it expensive for you. I have a rifle and plenty of ammunition, and this shack has good walls." "How many of your men are willing to die trying to drag one girl out of here? Because I promise you, some of them will not make it home." There was a long silence. Beatrice could see Howard conferring with his men, could see the way they shifted uneasily on their horses. They were hired hands, not killers, and the prospect of charging a fortified position held by a man with a rifle was clearly not appealing to them. Finally, Howard shouted again, and this time his voice was colder. "You have until dawn tomorrow to bring my niece out. After that, we will burn you out. That shack will go up like kindling, and you will both die screaming. Think about it, Cowboy. Is she really worth your life?" Then he wheeled his horse around and led his men back the way they had come, disappearing over a rise in the landscape. Beatrice let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, but Caleb remained tense at the window, watching. "Are they really leaving?" she asked. "Not far," Caleb replied. "They will make camp just out of sight and wait for dawn like he said. He wants us to spend the night thinking about burning to death, hoping we will panic and make a mistake." He finally turned away from the window and looked at her, his expression serious. "He means it, Beatrice. Come morning, they will try to burn us out if we are still here. So what do we do?" "We leave," Caleb said simply. "Tonight in the dark. They will be watching the shack, but if we are careful, we can slip past them. The horses are tired, but they have enough left in them for a few more miles, and once we have some distance, we can rest them properly." It was a desperate plan, risky and dangerous, but Beatrice could see no better option. She nodded agreement, and they settled in to wait for full darkness, eating a sparse meal and checking their supplies. Caleb had enough ammunition for his rifle and revolver to fight a small war, and he loaded both weapons with methodical care. As the last light faded from the sky, he moved to the back window and studied the landscape carefully. "There," he said quietly, pointing to a line of trees about 200 yards from the shack. "If we can reach that tree line, we can use it for cover and circle wide around their camp. It will add miles to our journey, but it should get us clear." They prepared the horses as quietly as possible, wrapping their hooves in cloth to muffle the sound. Caleb helped Beatrice into her saddle, his hands steadying her, and for a moment they were very close, their breath mingling in the frigid air. His gray eyes searched her face, and she saw concern there and determination, and something else that made her pulse quicken. "Stay close to me," he said softly. "If something goes wrong, if they spot us, you ride hard for those trees and you do not look back. Understand?" "I will not leave you," Beatrice said, surprised by the vehemence in her own voice. "If it comes to shooting, I can hold them off long enough for you to escape, but none of it matters if they catch you too." His hand came up and cupped her cheek, his palm warm against her cold skin. "Please, Beatrice, promise me you will run if you have to." She wanted to argue, wanted to refuse, but she saw the need in his eyes and understood that he could not do what needed to be done if he was worrying about her making a stand beside him. "I promise," she whispered. He nodded once, then mounted his own horse. They walked the animals slowly away from the shack, heading for the tree line Caleb had pointed out. The night was clear and bitterly cold, the stars brilliant overhead, and the snow-covered ground reflected enough light to see by. Every sound seemed amplified, the creak of saddle leather and the soft footfalls of the horses unnaturally loud. They were halfway to the trees when a shout went up from the direction of Howard's camp. Someone had spotted them. Caleb cursed and kicked his horse into a gallop, and Beatrice followed suit, leaning low over her mount's neck as they raced for the cover of the forest. Behind them, she heard more shouts and the thunder of pursuing hooves. They crashed into the trees just as the first shots rang out, bullets whining through the branches overhead. Caleb led them deeper into the forest, weaving between the trees with reckless speed, trusting his horse to find footing in the darkness. Beatrice clung to her saddle, branches whipping at her face and arms, her heart in her throat. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only minutes, Caleb slowed and then stopped, listening intently. The sounds of pursuit had fallen behind, confused by the forest and the darkness. He gestured for Beatrice to follow and led them in a wide arc, circling away from Howard's men and heading south toward Laramie. They rode through the rest of the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and check their direction by the stars. Beatrice was numb with cold and exhaustion by the time the eastern sky began to lighten, but Caleb kept them moving. He explained that putting as much distance as possible between them, and Howard was critical, that they could rest properly once they had a larger lead. The sun was well up when he finally called a halt in a sheltered ravine where a small creek ran beneath a crust of ice. The horses drank eagerly, and Caleb helped Beatrice down from her saddle. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, and he caught her, holding her steady until she found her balance. "You did well," he said, and she could hear the approval in his voice. "We covered a lot of ground last night. By the time they figure out which way we went, we will be too far ahead for them to catch easily." Beatrice wanted to feel relieved, but she was too tired. She sank down against a boulder, pulling her coat tight around her, and watched as Caleb tended to the horses with gentle efficiency. He was clearly exhausted too, his movements slower than usual, but he took care of the animals before seeing to his own needs. When the horses were settled, he came and sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. The contact was warm and comforting, and Beatrice found herself leaning into him without conscious thought. He did not pull away, instead shifting to put his arm around her shoulders, and she rested her head against his chest. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. For saving my life, for helping me, for believing me." "You do not need to thank me," Caleb replied, his voice rumbling in his chest beneath her ear. "I am exactly where I want to be." There was something in the way he said it that made Beatrice lift her head and look at him. His gray eyes met hers, and she saw in them what she had been afraid to acknowledge in herself. The connection between them was not just circumstance or shared danger. It was something deeper, something that had been building since the moment he stepped between her and her uncle's rifle. "Caleb," she whispered, not even sure what she was asking. He answered by leaning down and kissing her, his lips gentle against hers despite the roughness of his appearance. It was a careful kiss, questioning rather than demanding, and Beatrice felt something inside her unfurl like a flower opening to the sun. She kissed him back, her cold hands coming up to frame his face, and felt him smile against her mouth. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I have been wanting to do that since yesterday," he admitted, "but the timing never seemed right." "The timing is terrible now too," Beatrice pointed out, but she was smiling. "We are running for our lives from a murderous uncle and his hired guns. We are freezing and exhausted, and we have 100 miles still to travel." "Exactly," Caleb agreed. "If we wait for a perfect moment, we might never get one, so I am taking the moments we have." He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Beatrice felt the last of her reservations melt away. Whatever happened next, whatever dangers still lay ahead, she knew with absolute certainty that this man was worth fighting for, worth surviving for. He had risked everything to protect her, and she would do the same for him. They rested there for several hours, taking turns sleeping while the other kept watch. When they set out again in the early afternoon, Beatrice rode beside Caleb rather than behind him, and their legs brushed together as the horses walked. Small touches, barely noticeable, but each one sent warmth through her. They traveled for 4 more days, pushing south through the Wyoming wilderness toward Laramie. The weather stayed cold but clear, and they made good time despite the snow. They saw no sign of Howard or his men, but Caleb remained cautious, always choosing their camps carefully and keeping watch through the nights. On the 4th evening, they crested a rise and saw the lights of Laramie spread out in the valley below them. Beatrice felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. They had made it. Against all odds, they had survived the chase and the cold and the 100 miles of difficult travel. "Tomorrow we find Judge Mitchell," Caleb said, his voice rough with exhaustion and satisfaction. "Tomorrow we make sure your uncle answers for what he did." They found lodging at a modest hotel on the edge of town, taking separate rooms to maintain propriety, and Beatrice luxuriated in her first real bath in a week. The hot water soothed her aching muscles and washed away layers of dirt and fear. She dressed in fresh clothes that Caleb had bought for her with his carefully saved money, and when she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked older somehow, harder, but also more alive than she had ever been. The next morning they went to the courthouse and asked for Judge Mitchell. The clerk was initially dismissive, clearly not impressed by a trail-worn cowboy and a young woman with an unlikely story. But when Beatrice produced the journal and explained what it contained, his attitude changed dramatically. Within an hour, they were sitting in the judge's chambers, and the elderly man was reading through Howard Walsh's careful records with growing horror. "This is extraordinary," Judge Mitchell said finally, looking up at them with grave eyes. "If even half of what is written here is accurate, Howard Walsh is one of the most prolific murderers in the territory. But you understand that bringing him to justice will not be easy. He has money and influence, and he will use every resource at his disposal to fight these charges." "I understand," Beatrice said firmly. "But 17 families deserve justice, and I am prepared to testify to how I found that journal and what my uncle said to me. Mr. Osborne can testify to the confession he overheard and to my uncle's attempt to kill me." The judge nodded slowly. "I will issue a warrant for his arrest immediately and send federal marshals to bring him in. In the meantime, you should both stay here in Laramie where I can protect you. Walsh will undoubtedly try to retaliate, and I do not want to give him the opportunity." They spent the next 3 weeks in Laramie, waiting while the legal machinery ground slowly forward. Federal marshals rode north to Carbon County and arrested Howard Walsh at his ranch, bringing him back to Laramie in chains. His wife Margaret came with them, and when Beatrice went to see her aunt, she found a woman transformed by relief and guilt. "I knew," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "Not about all of it, but I knew some of what he did. I was too frightened to speak against him, too weak to stop him." "I am so sorry, Beatrice. I should have protected you." Beatrice held her aunt while she cried and felt her own anger at Margaret soften into something like pity. Her aunt had been another of Howard's victims, trapped by fear and circumstance. "You can help now," Beatrice said gently. "You can testify about what you knew, and you can help make sure he never hurts anyone else." Margaret nodded, wiping her eyes. "I will. I promise I will." The trial took place in February, and it was a sensation throughout the territory. Newspapers sent reporters to cover it, and the courtroom was packed every day with spectators eager to see the mighty Howard Walsh brought low. Beatrice testified for 2 full days, describing how she had found the journal and recounting her uncle's words and actions. Caleb testified about the confrontation in the Snowstorm and Howard's casual admission of murder. Margaret testified about years of abuse and the hints her husband had let slip about his criminal activities. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all 17 counts of murder. Judge Mitchell sentenced Howard Walsh to hang, and when the sentence was read, Howard's face went gray. He looked at Beatrice across the courtroom, and she met his gaze steadily, no longer afraid of him. "You destroyed me," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "You were supposed to be family." "You destroyed yourself," Beatrice replied. "I just made sure everyone knew the truth." Howard was hanged on the first day of March, 1885. Beatrice did not attend the execution, having no desire to watch any man die, even one who had tried to kill her. Instead, she spent that day with Caleb, walking along the creek that ran through Laramie and talking about the future. "What will you do now?" Caleb asked, his hand warm around hers. "Your uncle's property will be divided up and sold, with the proceeds going to the families of his victims. Margaret has already signed it over voluntarily, but you are free now. You can go anywhere, do anything." Beatrice stopped walking and turned to face him, studying his serious face and the gray eyes that had become so dear to her. "That depends," she said carefully. "On you, on what you want." Caleb's expression softened, and he pulled her closer, his arms circling her waist. What I want is to spend the rest of my life with you if you will have me. I know I am just a cowboy with no property and limited prospects, and you are an educated woman who could do much better. But I love you, Beatrice Walsh. I think I started loving you the moment you looked at me in that clearing with snow in your hair and fire in your eyes. Joy flooded through Beatrice, so intense it made her dizzy. I love you too, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. And you are not just anything. You are the man who saved my life and believed in me when no one else would. You are brave and kind and good, and I cannot imagine my future without you in it. Caleb kissed her then, right there beside the creek with the March wind blowing cold around them, and Beatrice kissed him back with all the love and gratitude and hope she felt. When they finally pulled apart, both smiling, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "The only thing of hers I still have. I know it is not fancy, but I would be honored if you would wear it, if you would marry me." Beatrice's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the ring, thinking of the woman who had worn it before her, the woman whose death had set Caleb on the path that led him to that clearing in the snowstorm where he had saved her life. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." They were wed a week later in a small ceremony at the Laramie Church, with Judge Mitchell standing as witness and Margaret Walsh weeping happy tears in the front pew. Beatrice wore a simple blue dress, and Caleb wore his Sunday best, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Beatrice felt as though her life was finally beginning, as though everything that had come before had been leading to this moment. They left Laramie the next day, heading west toward Colorado, where Caleb had been offered a foreman position on a large ranch outside of Denver. It was honest work with good pay, and it came with a small house on the property where they could start their life together. Beatrice had already arranged to sell her few remaining possessions, and with that money and what Caleb had saved, they had enough to be comfortable while they built their future. The ranch was everything Caleb had promised, a sprawling operation with good land and fair owners who treated their workers well. The house was small but sturdy, 2 rooms with a stone fireplace and real glass windows. Beatrice set about making it a home, sewing curtains and planting a garden, while Caleb worked long hours managing the ranch's cattle operation. They settled into married life with surprising ease, finding joy in simple things like evening meals together and quiet conversations by the fire. Caleb taught Beatrice to ride properly, and she taught him to appreciate poetry and literature, reading aloud to him in the evenings while he cleaned his tack or repaired equipment. They learned each other's rhythms and quirks, and their bond deepened from passion into something richer and more enduring. In the fall of 1885, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant. She told Caleb over dinner, watching his face go through a rapid series of emotions: surprise, joy, fear, and finally a fierce determination that made her smile. "We are going to have a baby," he said wonderingly, as if testing the words. Then he was around the table and pulling her into his arms, holding her so tightly she laughed, and told him to be careful of the child. Their son was born in May of 1886, a healthy boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. They named him Thomas, after Caleb's father, and Caleb held his son with such tenderness that Beatrice fell in love with him all over again. He was a devoted father, spending every free moment with Thomas, teaching him as he grew to walk and talk and eventually to ride. 2 years later, their daughter arrived, a red-faced, squalling infant they named Elizabeth after Beatrice's mother. Where Thomas was serious and thoughtful like his father, Elizabeth was all fire and energy, constantly getting into trouble and testing boundaries. Caleb adored her, and Beatrice often found him with his daughter on his lap, reading to her or telling her stories of the Old West that he carefully edited to be appropriate for small ears. The years passed, marked by the small triumphs and challenges of family life. Caleb was promoted to ranch manager, and with the increased salary, they were able to buy their own small property, 50 acres with water rights and good grazing land. It was nothing compared to Howard Walsh's ill-gotten empire, but it was theirs, earned through honest work and built on love rather than violence. Margaret Walsh came to visit often, having moved to Denver after Howard's execution. She and Beatrice rebuilt their relationship slowly, and Margaret proved to be a doting aunt to Thomas and Elizabeth. She had begun volunteering at a home for women escaping violent situations, using her own terrible experiences to help others find safety and start new lives. Beatrice herself became involved in women's advocacy, writing articles for Denver newspapers about the need for better legal protections for women, and speaking at meetings of reform-minded citizens. She used her own story sparingly, not wanting to be defined by what Howard had done, but when it served a purpose, she was willing to talk about how the law had failed to protect her, and how Judge Mitchell's intervention had saved her life. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Caleb took Beatrice back to Laramie, leaving the children with Margaret for the weekend. They visited the creek where he had proposed, finding it unchanged despite the passage of years. They talked about everything they had built together, about the children growing up strong and happy, about the ranch that was beginning to prosper, about the life they had created from ashes and terror. "You ever regret it?" Caleb asked as they sat on the creek bank, watching the water flow past. "Walking away from potential wealth and position. If your uncle had been honest, you would have inherited a fortune eventually." Beatrice looked at him, at the man who had risked everything for her, who had given her a life filled with love and purpose and joy. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "That fortune was built on blood and suffering. What we have is built on love and hard work, and it is worth more than all of Howard's money ever could be." She took his hand, threading her fingers through his, and felt him squeeze gently. "Besides," she added with a smile, "I got something far more valuable than money. I got you." Caleb pulled her close and kissed her, and Beatrice thought about the girl she had been, running through a snowstorm with death at her heels. That girl had been terrified and alone, with no one to trust and nowhere to turn. But in the darkest moment, when all seemed lost, a cowboy had stepped between her and danger and changed the course of her life forever. They returned to the ranch the next day, to their children and their work and their life together. Thomas was 7 now, old enough to start learning ranch work, and Caleb spent hours teaching him to handle horses and mend fences and read the signs of weather in the sky. Elizabeth at 5 was still too young for much work, but she followed her father and brother everywhere, determined not to be left out. As the years continued to pass, the small ranch grew and prospered. Caleb's reputation as an honest and skilled rancher spread, and other operations sought his advice. Beatrice's writing gained a wider audience, and she was invited to speak at events throughout Colorado and Wyoming. They worked together as partners in everything, making decisions jointly and supporting each other's ambitions. Thomas grew into a serious young man much like his father, steady and thoughtful and deeply kind. He took naturally to ranch work, and announced at 16 that he wanted nothing more than to work the land and raise cattle. Elizabeth surprised everyone by developing a passion for medicine after volunteering at the local doctor's office, and Beatrice worked tirelessly to find a medical school that would accept a female student, eventually succeeding when Elizabeth was accepted to the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. Margaret Walsh passed away peacefully in 1899, surrounded by the family she had failed to protect years earlier, but had worked hard to support in the decades since. Beatrice mourned her aunt, but took comfort in knowing that Margaret had found peace and purpose in her final years, that she had transformed her guilt into action that helped countless other women escape situations like hers. By 1905, Caleb and Beatrice had been married for 20 years, and their life had taken on a comfortable rhythm. The ranch was successful enough that they had hired help, allowing Caleb more time to spend with his family. Thomas had married a neighboring rancher's daughter and was building his own small place on a corner of their property. Elizabeth was in her final year of medical school, sending letters home filled with excitement about her studies and her plans to return to Colorado to practice. On their 20th anniversary, Caleb took Beatrice riding up into the mountains above their ranch, to a spot where they could see for miles in every direction. The land spread out below them, green and gold in the summer sunlight, and Beatrice felt a profound sense of gratitude for everything they had built together. 20 years, Caleb said, shaking his head in wonder. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday that I saw you running through that snowstorm. Other times it feels like you have been part of my life forever. Both are true, Beatrice replied, leaning against his shoulder. That night changed everything in an instant, but it also started something that grows stronger every day. Caleb was quiet for a moment, then said, I think about those 17 families sometimes, the ones your uncle killed. I wonder what their lives would have been like if he had not destroyed them, if they would have built something like we have. I think about them too, Beatrice admitted. I visit their graves when I can, and I've tried to help their surviving family members when possible. It is not enough, it can never be enough, but it is something. You did what needed to be done, Caleb said firmly. You made sure their deaths were not forgotten, that their killer faced justice. That takes courage most people do not have. They sat together in the mountain silence, watching the sun track across the sky and the shadows lengthen across the valley. Beatrice thought about the journey that had brought them here, about the terror and the flight, and the moment when a stranger had stood between her and death. She thought about the love that had grown from those desperate circumstances, about the family they had built and the life they had created. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Caleb helped Beatrice back onto her horse and they rode down the mountain together, heading home to the ranch and the life they had made. The years had changed them both, adding silver to Caleb's dark hair and lines around Beatrice's eyes, but the connection between them remained as strong as ever. Thomas and his wife Sarah welcomed their first child in the spring of 1906, a boy they named Caleb after his grandfather. The old cowboy was besotted with his grandson, spending hours rocking the baby and singing him old trail songs that Beatrice pretended not to hear. Elizabeth returned from medical school that summer, newly minted doctor, and opened a practice in the nearby town of Greeley, quickly becoming known for her skill and her particular compassion for female patients. The ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's increasingly capable management, and Caleb gradually stepped back from the day-to-day work, content to advise his son and enjoy his grandchildren. 3 more arrived over the next few years, filling the ranch with noise and laughter and life. Beatrice wrote a memoir of her experiences, carefully and thoughtfully told, and it became a surprise success, prompting discussions about justice and women's safety throughout the western states. In 1910, Wyoming became one of the first states to grant women the right to vote, and Beatrice cast her ballot with tears of joy streaming down her face. She thought of her mother, who had died before seeing this day, and of all the women who had fought for this right. She thought of Margaret, who had found her voice too late to save herself, but in time to help others. Caleb stood beside her at the polling place, his hand resting protectively on her back, and when she emerged from casting her vote, he pulled her into his arms and told her he was proud of her. She had worked for years to make this moment possible, writing and speaking and organizing, and now the dream was reality. They grew old together, Caleb and Beatrice, their love deepening with each passing year. They watched their children build their own lives and families, and they took joy in the small pleasures of each day: morning coffee together, evening walks around the property, quiet conversations by the fire. They had survived tragedy and danger and emerged stronger for it, their bond forged in crisis and tempered by time into something unbreakable. On a warm summer evening in 1915, exactly 30 years after their wedding, they sat together on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun set over the mountains. Their grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the breeze, and Beatrice felt a contentment so deep it brought tears to her eyes. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked, noticing her expression. "I am thinking about that night in the snowstorm," Beatrice replied. "About how terrified I was, how certain I was going to die, and about how you appeared like an answer to a prayer I had not even thought to say. I am thinking about how one moment of courage, one decision to help a stranger, changed both our lives forever." Caleb took her hand, his grip still strong despite his 70 years. "It was the easiest decision I ever made," he said simply. "Standing between you and danger, protecting you, loving you, all of it came as naturally as breathing." "You saved me," Beatrice said, her voice thick with emotion. "In every way a person can be saved." "No," Caleb corrected gently. "We saved each other. You gave me a purpose beyond just surviving. You gave me a family, a life worth living. We built this together, Beatrice. Everything we have, everything we are, we made it as partners." She knew he was right. Their love had never been about one person rescuing the other, despite how it began. It had always been a partnership, two people choosing each other every day and building something beautiful from shared effort and devotion. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, their grandchildren were called inside for bed, and the ranch grew quiet. Caleb and Beatrice remained on the porch, content in each other's presence, watching the night settle over the land they loved. They had built a good life, an honest life, and they had done it together. The past, with all its darkness, had been transformed into a future full of light, and neither of them would have changed a single moment of the journey that brought them here. Years continued to pass, each one adding to the rich tapestry of their life together. They celebrated 50 years of marriage in 1925, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren. The ranch had expanded significantly under Thomas's management, and now employed dozens of workers. Elizabeth had become one of the most respected doctors in northern Colorado, known particularly for her advocacy for maternal health and her work establishing a clinic for indigent women. Caleb's health began to decline in his 80s, his strong body finally yielding to the decades of hard work and the simple passage of time. Beatrice nursed him tenderly, reading to him when his eyes grew too weak for him to read himself, sitting with him on the porch in the evenings, and reminding him of all the good times they had shared. He remained clear-minded and good-humored almost to the end, telling stories to his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and dispensing the wisdom earned through a long and well-lived life. He died peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1929, with Beatrice beside him holding his hand. She mourned him deeply, feeling as though half of herself had been torn away, but she took comfort in the legacy they had built together. The ranch prospered, Their children were happy and successful, and the love they had shared continued to ripple outward through the generations. Beatrice lived another 8 years, spending her final years surrounded by family and writing her final book, a collection of letters between herself and Caleb over their long marriage. The letters revealed the depth of their connection, the challenges they had faced and overcome, and the enduring love that had sustained them through 54 years together. The book became a treasure for their descendants, a window into the remarkable partnership their grandparents had forged. She died quietly in her chair one autumn afternoon in 1937, a book of poetry open in her lap and a smile on her weathered face. Her children found her there and knew that she had gone to join Caleb, that they were together again as they had been meant to be. They buried her beside him on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a simple stone that bore both their names and a single line: "Love built on courage endures forever." The ranch continued for generations, always staying in the family, and the story of Caleb and Beatrice was passed down to each new generation as a reminder of what could be built when two people chose love and courage over fear and convenience. The journal that had started everything was donated to the Wyoming State Museum, where it served as a sobering reminder of the violence and lawlessness of the Wild West, and the importance of standing up for justice, even at great personal cost. Sarah Henderson, the woman whose desperate visit had prompted Beatrice to investigate her uncle, lived a long life and never forgot the girl who had avenged her family. She visited the Osborne Ranch often in her later years, bringing flowers to place on Caleb and Beatrice's graves, and telling anyone who would listen about the bravery it took to stand against Howard Walsh. The families of the 17 murdered ranchers eventually received compensation from the sale of Howard's properties, and several used the money to rebuild on their ancestral lands. They thrived, creating their own legacies and never forgetting that justice had come at last thanks to a young woman's courage and a cowboy's intervention. The story of that night in the snowstorm became legend in Wyoming and Colorado, told and retold until it took on mythic proportions. But for those who had known Caleb and Beatrice, who had witnessed the love between them and seen the life they built, the real story was better than any myth. It was a story of two people who found each other in the darkest of circumstances and chose to build something beautiful together. It was a story of courage and justice and love that endured through 54 years of marriage and beyond death itself. It was, quite simply, a story of two souls who recognized each other and refused to be parted, who turned terror into triumph and built a legacy that outlasted them both. And that, their children and grandchildren knew, was the truest kind of love story there was.